What does the multi-billion-dollar fraud of the federal government by Somali immigrants in Minnesota tell us about what's wrong with blue state governance? And why is the same state the site of a virtual insurrection of leftist activists seeking to prevent federal officials from enforcing immigration law? Today, on Think Twice, we talk to investigative journalist Ben Weingarten and take a deep dive into these stories, as well as asking why people who are opposed to Middle East peace are getting spots on President Donald Trump's Board of Peace. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with investigative journalist Ben Weingarten. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Why is the same state that was the venue for an infamous fraud case in which billions of dollars were stolen from federal taxpayers by Somali immigrants with ties to jihadists also the place where a virtual insurrection against federal law enforcement is taking place? The state is Minnesota, and the scandal surrounding the welfare fraud there speaks volumes about not just the political culture of that state, epitomized by the laughably incompetent Governor Tim Walz, but it also illustrates how the current progressive model of governance, which combines open borders advocacy with a generous welfare state, operates. That this is the same place where, with the encouragement of state and city government, left-wing activists are seeking to attack and obstruct federal officers doing their jobs, arresting illegal immigrants, is no coincidence. Nor is it a coincidence that the leading political figure of that community, Representative Ilhan Omar, is herself not only an apologist and advocate for jihadists and antisemitism, but also is implicated in frauds of her own. To discuss this, as well as his reporting on President Donald Trump's problematic Board of Peace, we're pleased to have with us today an outstanding investigative reporter and leading political commentator who has literally written the book on Ilhan Omar and her importance in understanding American politics in the 2020s. Benjamin Weingarten is a contributor to Newsmax, senior contributor to The Federalist, and a contributor to Real Clear Investigations. His writings can also be found at outlets including Real Clear Politics, The New York Post, and elsewhere. He is also the author of American Ingrate, Ilhan Omar, and the Progressive-Islamist Takeover of the Democratic Party. Ben Weingarten, welcome back to Think Twice.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Ben, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about your reporting on the Somali welfare fraud case in Minnesota. Some liberals and others, on the left, say it's wrong to highlight the story or to draw any conclusions from it. But why is it so instructive about what you've called the blue state model of governance?
I think what we see in Minnesota is the convergence of an open borders policy, or at least very liberal immigration policy, because a substantial percentage of the Somali population there was resettled ostensibly legally, although there was a lot of fraud involved there, which I can get to in a moment, plus the welfare state, and also not being at all discriminating in our immigration policy to the extent we're going to have a massive, quite generous welfare state of the kind that we see in Minnesota. Now, there are unique characteristics that I think created a powder keg for fraud at the scale that we've seen in Minnesota, in no small part because there was a refugee resettlement infrastructure that was already on the ground there, which made Minnesota a prime destination for the Somali diaspora in America. And Minnesota has a legacy of being a very generous state, or purportedly generous state, when it comes to welfare, social welfare programs. So this whole scandal essentially concerns a population in the Somali diaspora that, of course, let's note, and the legacy media doesn't want to talk about, what is the history of Somalia. But the Somalia that Ilhan Omar and many others emerged from was was a Marxist-Islamist dictatorship, which then collapsed essentially into tribal warfare in the early 1990s and turned Somalia into a failed state. If you look at modern day Somalia, there is rampant fraud, corruption, tyranny, oppression. And you can't just ignore that then when you look at the population that fled Somalia. Now, we might hope that these would be peoples who would reject the kind of regime that they left. But the bottom line is that when you look at how the population has operated in America, it's very clear that disproportionately, at minimum, in the feeding our future fraud scandal, the vast majority of those implicated are in the Somali diaspora. It's all concentrated, or primarily concentrated, in Ilhan Omar's district. And what I argue is that there is a story here, which is the unique characteristics of this population, the unique characteristics of this state, but it also reflects the Democrat model, which really has been around over 100 years. I mean, goes back to Tammany of vote buying and wealth redistribution schemes, essentially. But in this case, you have the defrauding. It's not just the very high levels of social welfare utilization by this population, but it's also been ripe for fraud. And the Ilhan Omar connection in the community is that the Feeding Our Future fraud, $250 million plus fraud scandal, which really started to unravel several years ago, but has finally broken out into a popular consciousness. This was enabled by legislation that Ilhan Omar introduced. It was uniquely exploited by her constituents, and there's a nexus between those constituents and Omar, including the fact that the scandal, which was essentially using COVID as a justification to say needy children who would normally get their lunches at schools, we are going to allow private providers, to the extent they have an NGO sponsor, to provide meals to students and then get reimbursement by the federal government via a state program. And when you look at the meal sites, Ground Zero, one of the most notorious meal sites, whose owners were purported meal sites because they were serving up ghost meals, essentially, to the tune of millions of dollars and millions of meals that were never served. Ground Zero for that was a highly politically connected restaurant where she held many events. And she actually filmed a video in early 2020 touting the legislation in that restaurant, which is just remarkably brazen. And then what I found in my reporting is that you look at some of the reporting on what campaign contributors were there of those who have been prosecuted or implicated in the prosecutions. And there's actually more individuals I found that had contributed to Ilhan Omar and been associated with her than had been previously reported, totaling over $10,000 in campaign contributions historically. And last but not least, and I think this is something that we'll have to see what happens in the prosecutions going forward and in the Trump administration, the Trump DOJ's focus now, intensification of its focus in the Twin Cities, is I found that in the exhibits list that was produced by federal prosecutors in the most significant of the prosecutions, and there were many separate cases because you're talking about 90 people or so who have been pursued here, in the central case, there were exhibits indicating that the federal government had in its possession contacts, email communications, and records of phone calls between Congresswoman Omar's office and the leading organization that sponsored the fraud, an NGO that sponsored the fraud, Feeding Our Future. So what else in evidence did the feds collect when they were prosecuting? And is there a tighter nexus between the many political figures in this area and those who essentially ran this fraud? And so when I talk about the blue state model, it's sort of this fusion of the political class, the recipients of its largesse, the defenders, in this case, of the community that has been implicated in the fraud. And I think when we see the administration is going to scrutinize the welfare programs in other states, states that have larger illegal alien populations, I think we're going to find that there are much wider payoffs and fraud and corruption and abuse associated with it. And then you layer in the NGOs as well, which maybe we can think of as the quote unquote private sector extension of the administrative state. But you could be looking at something like money laundering through the NGOs plus the defrauding of a system that had no safeguards essentially put in place. And COVID allowed for unique exploitation of lax safeguards, but we've seen that there's massive waste, fraud, and abuse in social welfare programs even before COVID, and even in programs that were not created post-COVID.
Yeah. Let's drill down a little bit more about Ilhan Omar. It's not just a coincidence that, it happened in her congressional district. You literally wrote the book about Ilhan Omar. And, it's not just that she's one of the ringleaders of the left-wing congressional squad, sort of pro-jihadist when it comes to Israel, guilty of antisemitism in her own right. But she has links to the regime in Somalia, doesn't she? And how does this all connect, as well as there are serious accusations of fraud against her personally? And how does this all link together?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that I've argued is that she personifies some of the Somali diaspora community. And you mentioned the personal fraud. Let's talk about that for a second. So there's focus now on how is it that she went from a marginal net worth to a net worth of reportedly between $5 and $30 million. And there's going to be a worthwhile investigation, I think, into her husband's business dealings, which it's hard to fathom how the wealth exploded based upon what's been revealed in court filings about the failures of his business ventures. Let's also note that the relationship with this husband, there were allegations of improprieties around her funneling of campaign funds to an outfit that he ran in the private sector, and then she ends up marrying him, of course. So this was a recipient of funds purportedly for campaign purposes, political purposes, to an entity he controlled, and then they get married thereafter. But the fraud around Ilhan Omar concerning the alleged marriage to her brother, and then the fact that that marriage occurred under the oversight of a Christian minister, which doesn't make any sense because she talked about being married in her Islamic faith prior. And there are all sorts of issues there around the fact that she wasn't actually married under U.S. law necessarily to her original husband. But set aside
this isn't, I think when people hear this, they think it's sort of National Enquirer, sort of tabloid, myths, that she's just a celebrity that people are taking shots at and making things up about. This isn't made up, is it?
Not made up at all. The tax records are the tax records. The marriage records are the marriage records. The fact that she is so coy and quiet about the fact that she was married to this individual for several years. She, according to address records, was living at the same address as the alleged brother husband and the actual husband at the time. All of these things raise major questions. And I delve into all this in chapter 11 of my book, American Ingrate. If you want the sort of thumbnail sketch version, I'd urge everyone to check out. Scott Johnson did a recent piece on this for the Free Beacon, where he lays out the social media evidence, the records, etc., which raise very serious questions about all this. The big takeaway, I think, would be, did she get married to this individual to help him get an education in the U.S.? And what potential fraud or criminality was associated with the link between the two? And I think what it illustrates also is potential questions about immigration fraud in the Somali diaspora community writ large. It's worth noting that the State Department had a family reunification program, which was so abused primarily by Somalis. Thousands and thousands of Somalis entered the U.S. under this family reunification program. The State Department actually had to shut the program down, I believe, between 2008 and 2012, because it was found that people were alleging they were family members when they were not family members. So rampant fraud in that program. And so I think you can see there's a thread that runs through here of in Ilhan Omar's own life and arguable alleged fraudulence, in the fraudulence of how thousands of Somalis came to the U.S. And then if you look at the fraudulence in Somalia and the corruption there, and then what we've seen in this community here, I think what this illustrates is that you have to have an immigration policy that is very discriminating about the worldviews of the people who are coming in, what they're going to contribute, what their culture is like, what they abide. And then when you add on to that, to your point, you mentioned Omar's ties to the Somali population.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many folks in the Somali diaspora in the Minneapolis community, some of whom have actually ran for office back in Somalia, but spend a lot of time in the U.S. as well. She talks about the fact that we are doing things to advance our community. We want to advance Somalia as an putatively American representative here. But I think it speaks to the fact that there is a deep attachment to that country. Plus, you look at, of course, the hundreds of millions of dollars in funds that have been funneled back there by many in this community, allegedly. And I think it ultimately speaks to, for some, taking advantage of the generosity of America, not to advance America, and almost a resentment and exploiting our system to advance causes that have nothing to do with America's national interests. And that's before we get to the Al-Shabaab ties in this community.
I wanted to get to that.
There's been numerous terror prosecutions, particularly from the Twin Cities area. And the last tie there to Ilhan Omar is that she actually wrote a letter calling for clemency, calling for lenience, rather, in one of the prosecutions of several individuals prosecuted on terror charges. She wanted leniency for them, and she talked about her ties to them. So it's all of a piece. And obviously, this extends beyond her to other political representatives in and around that area. But she personifies the myriad problems here.
Yeah, and it's sort of, this is not, I mean, you know, her defenders and rationalizers will say, well, she's just speaking up for her community and, you know, their ties to, you know, their old home. There's nothing unusual about that. There are plenty of ethnic communities that sort of advocate for better relations with other countries where they had their origins. But she, you know, does it in a context. She recently even, you know, said sort of, it's a very anti-American, and her ties to the government in Somalia are troubling too, aren't they?
They are, and I lay some of those out in my book. Also, if you look back historically, she had pretty high-level contacts when she was a mere state legislator with Turkish representatives as well, and I think even met with Erdogan on the sidelines of one of the UNGA meetings that are held annually, I think maybe dating back to when she was a state legislator, or certainly early in her time as a member of the U.S. House. And that's interesting in and of itself. Why would this relatively low-ranking figure at the time be having meetings with high-level representatives, dignitaries of Turkey? And when you look at the ties between the two countries, Turkey and Somalia have a very extensive, ironclad alliance there. So the nexus, actually, the genesis of my book was that I wrote a piece saying, what if we applied, this is dating back now, the Russian collusion sort of paradigm of links, ties, and coordination between Ilhan Omar and Islamic supremacist individuals, entities, and governments? What would we find? And a publisher reached out to me after that and said, let's turn that into a book. And that got me started on this whole road to studying and reporting on a figure who holds the U.S. in such contempt, and to your point, has all sorts of questionable and dubious ties that are more than worthy of scrutiny, and highly doubt this person could get a security clearance on the merits, yet she was at one time sitting on the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
That's an important point, but let's tie it into sort of what's going on in the news right now in Minnesota. And it's an open question that I'd like to explore. Why is the war that the left is waging against ICE and the enforcement of immigration laws, how is this related to these scandals? How does this open borders advocacy relate to, you know, the scandals revolving around in Minnesota? Is it all a coincidence that it's happening there? Why is that so?
Well, and also dating back to the George Floyd activism as well. And certainly,
Yeah,
I think,
another bizarre coincidence.
and I do think that there is an attempt to kind of stoke a George Floyd 2.0 reaction, and it's yet to be seen whether that will be the case, and this explodes into a national anti-ICE movement, although we've obviously already seen agitation in a number of cities where there's been surges of ICE officers. So is it coincidence or not? What I would say is this. You have the scandal of the exploitation of, due to, I would argue, at very, very best criminal negligence and probably something worse, the exploitation and the pilfering of billions of dollars in public funds in Minnesota. And then you have, of course, the scrutiny on the politicians who presided over the programs, starting with Governor Walz and then on down, and the links and ties between the local Twin Cities figures and many of the individuals implicated. And it just so happens that as those stories are finally getting national scrutiny after several years of these prosecutions happening, and you have a surge in ICE forces, which is at least partially linked to the allegations of the fraud and corruption, et cetera, that then they're trying to ignite a powder keg and essentially calling for insurrectionary acts and trying to fight federal law enforcement figures on the ground. There are no coincidences in politics, in my view. I do think this creates a diversion. It all fits in the left's framework of, well, first of all, they've been anti-ICE and anti-immigration enforcement for a long time. These are de facto, if not de jure, sanctuary jurisdictions that we're talking about on the ground in Minnesota. And so they will first cry racism. And by the way, the Feeding Our Future fraud scandal, of course, the community cried racism to try and fight the scrutiny that they were getting over allegations of fraud dating back to the 2021-2022 period when the fraud was starting to become readily apparent. So there's a defense and there's closing ranks for and circling the wagons for the Somali diaspora community that is a very potent political force there. Then there is the broader antipathy towards the idea that we are actually going to restore sovereignty within our interior. Then you have the animus towards the Trump administration itself, and then you have the midterm elections. Plus you have the wanting to obfuscate and obscure from and deflect from the fraud and the scrutiny that the fraud has brought upon the leaders in the Twin Cities area and then at the state level in Minnesota. So I think you put all that together, it would be obvious why you'd have the political leaders trying to stoke the anti-ICE backlash. And then you have a state where, particularly in the Twin Cities areas, because it's not the same in the suburbs and in the more rural areas of the state, but in the cities, it's radically progressive. There are radical progressive activist groups, the same types that were activated during the George Floyd Summer of Love and prior to that as well. You'll note that in the rushing of the church that recently occurred, I believe in St. Paul, that there were Black Lives Matter activists who were part of the cohort doing so. And I've done some writing and research on some of the groups on the ground. And if you look at the Minnesota ICE Watch group and their social media page, and this was the entity that reportedly Renee Good was affiliated with, they talk about they're not just opposed to ICE, they're against any police forces. They would call themselves anti-fascist, anti-colonialist forces. And at the end of the day,
it's the same defund the police routine that we heard, 5-6 years ago, wasn't it?
It's exactly the same. It's the same groups that activate. There's a nexus to the quote-unquote pro-Palestinian Hamasnik groups.
Well, that was my next question, is there some overlap there as well with sort of the mobs, that we've seen over the last, since October 7th, 2023. It seems very familiar, doesn't it?
It's the same sorts of networks using the same sorts of tactics. It's an intersectional alliance, to use a word that I guess has sort of gone out of fashion, but is how they used to describe themselves. When you look at who the groups, the entities are who are oftentimes promoting the rallies and who are anti-ICE. And then also the tactics, when you look at some of the materials promoted by these quote unquote ICE watch groups, which, by the way, if you look at their activities, I mean, these are essentially insurgents on the ground. They are collecting intel on federal law enforcement officers. They're surveilling them. They're recording their license plate numbers. They're tailing them. They're tipping off individuals and communities when there are raids occurring. They have a whole bevy of legal resources at their disposal. And then they talk about all sorts of tactics to use, up to and including promoting de-arresting, according to one primer that was shared by the Minneapolis ICE Watch group. And if you look in that manual in de-arresting, they say that each de-arrest constitutes, and I'm quoting here, a microintifada. So if you want your link to the pro-Palestinian sort of tactics, their worldview, their animus towards, again, sovereignty, having any sort of control over immigration, deportations, etc., it's all of a piece. It's not, you haven't seen necessarily CARE, for example, that I've seen be out front in terms of leading the agitation there. But when you look at who the groups are on the ground, the rhetoric, and I bet you some of the individuals, if you're to delve deeply, and certainly this is the case elsewhere, you have CARE, certainly among other organizations, has proven to be heavily anti-ICE.
The Council on American Islamic Relations, which Ilhan Omar is a leading advocate for, but as well as a pro-Hamas front.
Exactly. And she said, of course, some people did something when she said that about 9/11. That was in front of, I believe, CARE's Los Angeles chapter, where she made those remarks. And so we'll see ultimately, after all is said and done, we've seen, for example, that the certain House committees have advocated looking into the nonprofit statuses of some of these sorts of front groups. And it's on the left, and it's also the Islamic supremacist front groups. I think there's going to be substantial scrutiny on all of them, because you have to ask, is this a criminal conspiracy at the end of the day to obstruct law enforcement, to shield and harbor illegal aliens? And of course, this is a problem that is of the politicians making, because they didn't have local forces cooperating with ICE. This doesn't happen in Minnesota if you have cooperation between state and local law enforcement and federal law enforcement when it comes to detaining individuals and deporting them. And the chaos, of course, is a feature, not a bug, of the left-wing worldview. And so you have this toxic brew, and Minneapolis is ground zero for it today, but you're certainly going to see it in other cities. And we've certainly seen the anti-ICE agitation and the attacks on on ICE officers in a wide variety of places, including of the vehicular variety.
Right. One element of this is the hypocrisy, because if these were sort of right-wing activists, if they were demonstrating against COVID policies, or, need we say the January 6th, rioters, the people on the left, the liberal media would be calling for their heads, and that would resonate. But obviously, they're not so zealous about defending law enforcement when they're not laws that they favor. But I guess my other question is, and this is just asking you to sort of take the temperature of American politics at the moment. Is this insurrection succeeding? If you read the New York Times, watch CNN, if you read some of the polls, depending on how the questions are asked, the anti-ICE insurrection seems to be very popular. Is the tide, this goes against, Trump was elected on a pledge to deport illegal aliens. And I think if you ask people that question, they're still for that. But do you think this sort of intifada, if you will, in Minnesota, is this helping to change public opinion? As Renee Good, she may not have been sort of elevated to the level of sainthood that George Floyd was, but has the tide turned against Trump and the effort to enforce these laws in this way?
I think you're right to note that it's hard to square the overwhelming support for mass deportations during the election with, and by the way, of course, the shutdown of the border that we've seen, which is a significant, massive achievement in and of itself, versus now some polls that suggest that the anti-ICE forces are sort of winning in the battle of public opinion. I think it's worth taking polls with a grain of salt while also acknowledging that the propaganda from legacy media and Democrat politicians and all the institutions that they still control is incredibly thick, it's potent, it's powerful. When the left creates this scenario where it's a weaponized and militarized police force coming in and snatching innocent people who are here just because they're seeking a better life, and they promote the stories and try and find the most sympathetic possible cases and then distort the cases to the nth degree to the pro-open border side, essentially. That's very hard to combat. And I think that's why you've seen the administration, first of all, touting the fact that you have something like in the nature of 3/4 of the illegal aliens that have been deported have been criminal illegal aliens, and then a substantial portion have committed crimes here. And then you now see the administration focusing on releasing the pictures and the profiles of those who are being detained and deported, because they understand that there's an information warfare aspect to this as well. It's not just about winning the policy. It's also about winning the hearts and minds. So are the anti-ICE forces winning? They're always going to have the default on the side of the legacy media and the Democrats, which are going to say that they are on the side of the righteous, the good, and the virtuous, and they're against this oppressive police state apparatus, at least when the folks on the ground are supporting a cause that they deem to be favorable to their shared interests. So ultimately, unfortunately, it's incumbent upon the administration not only to faithfully execute the policies and vigorously execute them, but also to fight in the information landscape. And that's a very hard thing. It's hard to win on both grounds. If you have to pick one, I win on the substance over the optics. But obviously, this matters and matters for the midterms and beyond. I do question, however, to the extent the American people see that you have left-wing revolutionaries in the streets that are hitting cops with shovels and stealing cars and ramming people, and you've seen these massive increases in doxing and assaults on agents, attacks on agents, is that going to play well? I care more about the merits of the policy than the politics, personally, but I do question whether America is in the mood, whether Americans are going to effectively, again, want to bend the knee and say, we need to make the pain stop of the violence in the streets that the left that is engaging in, the coercion, and so now we need to vote Democrat again. I'm not sure that that is necessarily how it's going to play out. I'm not sure if in the purple districts this is going to play all that well, but I also don't think necessarily that Democrats would be advocating for this sort of agitation if they didn't think there was a powerful political reason to do it. And maybe, look, part of it may be, first of all, they have to mollify the radical left-wing base. And then also it may be good for fundraising from their perspective as well. So you have to look at all these different competing factors, I think, and we'll see when the weather warms up and to the extent you continue to have surging of ICE forces into areas that are sanctuary areas with large illegal alien populations, if the agitation is going to amp up and be amplified, or if Democrats recognize that it's a losing political message.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I tend to view it as, this is the resistance. This is the latest iteration of the anti-Trump resistance, which seemed to be very quiet after, the elections in 2024. I think a lot of people on the right expected there to be a big explosion, if Trump won, which he did, but there wasn't. I think, the left really had been battered by, having to spend a year, apologizing for Joe Biden and then pretending that Kamala Harris was, a viable candidate for president. But now they sort of gotten their win back, and that this is just, the same, desperate effort to delegitimize anything this administration does, and the bad orange man fashion, reviving the idea that democracy is in danger, and what's needed is to take to the streets. To me, this is just the latest iteration of that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's one long line that starts with Russiagate and runs through this, and there are different actors. You have the street agitators and the radical revolutionaries, and then you have the more cynical politicians, and then you have the weaponization of the lawfare apparatus. And really, to your point, the legal resistance has been where the resistance has been during most of year one of President Trump. It's been hundreds of lawsuits trying to stop him from using every lever of executive power possible to execute his agenda. But the cohorts on the streets are certainly rounding up now and rearing for action. And one other point that's worth making, I think you're absolutely right. It's about delegitimizing the administration. It's about the midterms potentially. It's about thwarting this policy. There's a reason why, another political reason why you would want to thwart the policy of mass deportations. And that is that illegal aliens and non-citizens broadly are counted in the census. And that is used, of course, to apportion House districts. So if you have millions of illegal aliens who are being deported from the country, you potentially can have Democrats losing House seats as a consequence of it. So it's a political imperative as well to try and maintain these populations.
Yeah. Let me ask one more political question before we turn to foreign policy, and relates to something that I wrote about this week. And this was the leaking of Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's memoir, where he related how he was vetted by Kamala Harris's team. And I think this speaks to what we've already alluded to, sort of the state of the left-wing base and their, sort of ideological extremism, as well as, they're at best being soft on anti-Semitism and at worst being openly anti-Semitic, where, he was asked whether he was if he was an Israeli double agent, and would he apologize for condemning anti-Semitism at the University of Pennsylvania? In part, obviously, Shapiro is not is not exactly the most zealous defender of Israel in the Democratic Party, or even in the state of Pennsylvania among Democrats. But he's also very identifiably Jewish. He's clearly not only looking to kneecap Kamala Harris, in advance of her possibly being a rival for the 2028 Democratic nomination, but I think this sort of speaks to a general question of, whether the Democratic Party on these issues. He's clearly hoping to create a lane for sort of a traditionally sort of moderate liberal Democrat to be its standard bearer. But, has that time come and gone? And is it, the left-wing base has turned to run the Democratic Party?
Well, first, and this gets to your point, what does it say that someone who isn't even a staunch advocate for a strong Israel as being in support of America's national interest, if nothing else, setting aside whether it's moral right and all the other myriad benefits to the relationship, what does it say that basically, by dint of being Jewish and not anti-Israel, they raised the dual loyalty canard in vetting him to be a vice president? I mean, that says everything you need to know about the state of the Democrat Party. I think it's a dead party, effectively, for those who are anything but Jewish in name only. And the fact of the matter is that it's hard to see how there is any lane for anything approximating a Bill Clinton-like figure. And when I say Bill Clinton-like figure, someone who triangulates, someone who has mass appeal. They work for the populace. They can appease the progressives to a degree, but they're viewed as common sense, traditional, and something that can be broadly appealing, that takes the right side of 80-20 issues, et cetera. I just don't see how you get the numbers to work. Now, maybe in his case, beyond kneecapping Kamala, and that might be viewed as enough in its own right for him, it may be that he expects that there's going to be such a fracturing among the candidates on the Democrat side that maybe there is a lane especially when you're talking about the representative of Pennsylvania, a massively significant state, certainly in a general election. Now, that said, my understanding is that the DNC apparatus, and this is going way down the road, but we're not far, obviously, from talking about all this. The DNC is largely in hoc to Kamala and her forces. So that's obviously going to be a factor as well down the road. And I think if you control the DNC machine, that obviously gives you an inside advantage relative to others. But you can imagine a field with Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom and then AOC and who knows who else. And maybe the thinking on the Shapiro side is, I represent a state, which is a state that is perfectly illustrative of America in terms of its political composition. You haven't heard of massive scandals in my state, et cetera. You can imagine the sort of message.
Well, leaving Philadelphia aside.
Yeah, well, sure, obviously, outside of the default scandal-ridden Philly. But he'll present himself as, I'm a moderate, centrist, Democrat, and I'm electable. And maybe that message works, but I don't think ultimately, I don't see how he washes on the Democrat side because, look, the progressives, I wouldn't even call it a hostile takeover, but they've had a takeover of the party. And I was writing about this in the Ilhan Omar book 5 years ago about if you looked at what the positions were in the Democrat primary, and they were pretty indistinguishable from where the Congressional Progressive Caucus was on a whole slew of issues, far beyond foreign policy to domestic matters as well. So is there a lane for him? It's hard to imagine it, again, unless you have a field that's split 20% across 5 candidates, I guess. Hard to envision, and it's in part the view on Israel and Jews is of the Democrats is reflective of the progressive ideology and then the coalition that they have put forth. I mean, they fundamentally reject our Judeo-Christian, in my view, large portion of the Democrat Party and its progressive base fundamentally reject Judeo-Christian Western civilization, are hostile towards America, feel that it's incumbent upon the forces that are anti-American to topple those who stand in their way. That includes America, that includes Israel, and that includes faithful, traditional Jews, Christians, and others who would stand in their way. And this is one of the reasons I argue that the left and the Islamic supremacist forces are aligned. It's not that they agree on every issue, but they have a common enemy, and that enemy is us.
Yeah, it's what intersectionality really means. I want to pivot now to foreign policy and ask you about, I think, an important piece that you wrote in the last week about Trump's Board of Peace, which he's promoting. I mean, and I don't know whether it's sort of an alternative. It's sort of growing in importance, and with the administration, whether it's an alternate, United Nations, or if it's just, a scheme to govern Gaza in the aftermath of the post-October 7th war. Most of the discussion has been about his appointment of foreign leaders like Turkish President Erdogan, who are anything but pro-peace. But you've reported about the so-called and apolitical technocrat who's been appointed to lead a team that will supposedly govern the Gaza and help rebuild it. What should we know about him, and what should we know about the Board of Peace that we're not really hearing about?
Well, first on the Board of Peace part of things, it is fascinating to look at the charter of the Board of Peace, and it is, I think, entirely silent on Gaza itself, which does suggest that this interpretation that this is maybe an alternate to the UN that is US-led and controlled, because ultimately the power really resides in the president at the end of the day as the head of the Board of Peace with discretion over all of it. That is an intriguing, it's obviously provocative for the globalists and the internationalists. They loathe that.
It's throwing the gauntlet down to them. And, certainly the UN is arguably, just can't be repaired. It's hopeless.
And so to that end, one aspect is this is sort of flouting the international institutions, which I do think in and of itself is a good thing. I also think that when it comes to take the extraction of Maduro, for example, an international law was raised. Well, the U.S. is not bound or shouldn't be bound by international law. We have the laws of our land at the end of the day. And so a transgressive action that's hated by all the world's dictators and anti-American regimes is ultimately a positive thing. Also, it's worth noting it could be that part of the view internally within the administration about the Board of Peace, and this is just speculation, is that this is competition for the UN. So it sort of puts pressure on the UN as an institution to actually not work completely antithetically to America's interests when we pay a disproportionate percentage of the budget and the UN sits in Turtle Bay and is used to legitimize and elevate our adversaries against us. So I think there is that aspect of it potentially as well. But with respect to this technocratic committee, so-called apolitical technocratic committee, first question that I would have, and this piece that I wrote on my Substack on Ali Shaath, who's running the apolitical so-called technocratic committee on the ground, and then that sits under a couple other layers within the Board of Peace. But putatively is supposed to be managing the day-to-day in Gaza ultimately. The question that my piece raises, and I'll talk about Shaath in a moment, but the question my piece raises is there anyone who Americans would define, and let alone Israelis would define, as apolitical and technocratic that would be selected to sit on such a committee? When you look at the ties of most of the individuals sitting on there, many of them have backgrounds in administration. These are people who worked in building infrastructure, economic development, water management, land management, etc. But disproportionately, these are people who are affiliated with or worked in the Palestinian Authority, are aligned with Fatah. What does Fatah stand for? Fatah is Hamas light as an entity in terms of its charter and in terms of the policies that advances. And we can talk about pay to slay. We can talk about support for quote unquote resistance efforts. We can talk about Palestinian Authority controlled police forces that have been involved with jihadist attacks, etc. And of course, as well, the indoctrination of the population that they rule over in an Islamic supremacist worldview that is genocidally anti-Semitic. And one of the points of the 20-point peace plan is that you have to have reform of the PA from which many of these people will emerge. Well, why do you have to have reform of it? Because it is a Islamic supremacist, genocidal, jihadist, Jew-hating indoctrinator and entity. So many of these people have ties to the PA and Fatah. Ali Shaath, who leads that technocratic committee, is one of them. If you look at his resume would suggest that he has experience in running day-to-day infrastructure operations and bureaucratic management of these essential services that a government would provide in a place like Gaza. However, I looked at just a couple of recent interviews that he's done in the last year, and this gets to the question of, the president has said that these individuals are committed to peace. Do his own remarks, that is Ali Shaath, the leader of the technocratic apolitical committee, do they reflect a devotion to peace or something else? And when you look at his remarks, he essentially says, and I lay these out, I quote them verbatim in my Substack, but I'll paraphrase here. He essentially talks about the fact that we need a Palestinian state, that resistance is a genuine expression of political will, that you can't just deny Hamas and others their place in a society. And he refers to Israel as the occupation repeatedly in his remarks. So he apes the rhetoric that we've seen from Palestinian Arabs who have been devoted to Israel's destruction for time immemorial.
Let's just point out, when people like that refer to occupation, they're not referring necessarily just to Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, They're talking about every inch of Israel.
Yes, talking about every inch of Israel, and it's a purposeful euphemism. I think it's almost designed to fool those who are either gullible or ignorant of what these words actually mean. And so at the end of the day, when you look at much of his rhetoric, he seems very skeptical of the Trump plan. He doesn't like the idea that there are going to be any other international authorities or governments represented. He believes ultimately in the creation of a Palestinian state tying Gaza to Jerusalem, to Judea and Samaria. He's very clear about that. He's very explicit about it. And that ultimately the economic plans need to be part and parcel of a much more ambitious political plan. He's even talked about in the early days moving some of the debris out into the sea and creating new land from it and actually expanding Gaza territory itself. So at the end of the day, I think that he illustrates the fact that even here, when you're talking about trying to put apolitical, technocratic people on, people who might actually have knowledge and experience to be able to deal with day-to-day necessities on the ground, mundane tasks, they're all ideological, or it certainly seems that way based upon his rhetoric, his affiliations, and his actions. And I imagine if we similarly scrutinize others who are part of this purportedly technocratic apolitical committee, many of whom are affiliated with Fatah and the PA, we're going to find similar statements and similar policies that they have supported. And this gets to a broader question that I raised in a piece after you had the cessation and hostilities and the advancement of the 20-point plan, which is, at the end of the day, there's a question, and this is a tension that is in administration policies that go beyond Israel and Gaza and everywhere, is what actually animates and drives the people on the ground? Do they care primarily about economic growth and living a dynamic and vibrant sort of existence of the kind that we would want? Or are there other factors that predominate in the minds of those on the ground and that are the key drivers? And so when it comes to Israel and Gaza and beyond, really the question is, do you have a population that would be supportive of the kind of plan that the administration has set forth? And how are you going to de-radicalize, denazify that population? And when you've looked at public opinion polls of the Palestinian Arab population in Gaza and in Judea, Samaria, of course, you have massive percentages of the population that supported October 7th, support Hamas's putative leaders, support quote-unquote resistance, including violent resistance, which is to say jihad against Israel. And remember, of course, there was a Gaza population that supported Hamas in the first place. So at the end of and was complicit in October 7th crimes and many crimes before that. So you put all that together, and the fundamental challenge, the question becomes, do you actually have someone who wants to engage in and be a part of the kind of deal that you're talking about? And this, of course, has been the issue that's plagued all the quote-unquote peace process dating back for decades, which is there's one side that defines peace, in my view, as your obliteration, your destruction, and not a single Jew in Israel. And that is the seminal problem. That's the seminal challenge at the end of the day. It transcends Gaza, but is obviously going to be the essential challenge is, one, how is Hamas being demilitarized? And it feels as if maybe the cart's been put before the horse a little bit there. And then second, do you have a population that is actually willing to integrate into the modern world and to not want to destroy Israel? And I think there's little evidence of that. And I think it's very telling that even the purported technocrats and apolitical leaders on these committees, first of all, got sign-off from Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, according to reporting. And second of all, that they themselves in their backgrounds have all sorts of affiliations that are counter to the mission, the stated mission of peace.
Right. Well, I think those are all really important points, but I don't think we can talk about peace in the Middle East without touching at least a bit on Iran and what U.S. policy towards Iran is or is going to be. We're speaking right now as the protests against the regime in Tehran continue. The United States threatened to take action against Iran, has sort of backed off. We're not clear where that's going. There's obviously something of a debate within the administration between those who would want a more aggressive approach towards at least, if not toppling, or at least aiding those who want to topple the leading state sponsor of terror in the world, as well as, the engine of anti-Americanism in the Middle East. And those who, I don't think it's mischaracterizing it, seem to be wanting to revive the policies of the Obama administration and, let's negotiate with them, let's cut a deal with them. Where do you see this going?
I think that always it pays to look towards the president's remarks and the president's actions today and historically to determine ultimately where things are going. Who wins in the debate over we want to have negotiations versus we want to topple the regime? One might have thought previously that there was going to be a deal. Iran said no, and then the president kept to his word and the nuclear infrastructure was destroyed, and Israel really had operational control there for at least those 12 days, and we can hope and expect that they also use those 12 days to get further assets in place on the ground and be in a position to advance interests antithetical to those of the regime. So, look, the president said he promised vigorous action. He called for the protesters to go out there. Before that, I thought it was notable that when Prime Minister Netanyahu visited Mar-a-Lago, the president went out there to say that this is a cruel regime and it shoots its protesters. Usually he doesn't talk about the nature of evil regimes. So he was even making that sort of rhetorical argument there as opposed to, the real politic, hard-headed, we have to deal with people as they are. They're thieves and murderers and liars and terrorist leaders all over the world, etc. That was notable. So he gave rhetorical support there as well. And now you had this threat of massive strike and then a backing off. But by the same token, we now have the U.S. now has assets being positioned and surging into the region. It saw the Iranian regime's response when it thought it might be an existential peril. I do think that the president has always been genuine. He'd love to make a deal with the regime. This goes back to the question of, do you have a regime to make a deal with? And ultimately, is that deal something that you can tolerate when, and the president has acknowledged this, they might just be tapping him along. He said that historically. And of course, that is what they have done repeatedly.
That's what they've always done.
It's what they've always done. They bide their time. Tyrannical regimes they certainly can outlast U.S. presidents, and they certainly outlast the expectations often of their critics, especially when they're willing to kill en masse thousands of their citizens within days. So I think the reporting which shows that the president is looking for what are decisive actions that can be taken. First of all, I think that's prudent and that makes sense. Obviously, the U.S. has no desire to occupy any country on earth. And we see this obviously in Venezuela as well. It's sort of like taking out Saddam Hussein, but no de-Baathification. And that's sort of where we are. And we should be careful, obviously, with drawing all these analogies because Iran is different from Iraq, is different from Afghanistan, is different from Venezuela. But there's clearly not a desire to occupy a country that was once a dynamic, relatively secular, relatively liberal, friendly place with a lot of capabilities that can be brought to bear. The question is ultimately, what strikes can you take that would be decisive? How do you secure your vital interests in the immediate aftermath? And then what does the subsequent government in place look like? And I imagine that the administration has is assessments of all of these things. Obviously, meeting with the Crown Prince, notable in terms of what the day after the regime might look like. Now, going backwards, it's also notable that the administration called for is stopping the 12-day war at 12 days. Why did it do that? And to what extent? There's been mixed reporting. There's always mixed reporting about what an Israel Council and to what extent did that factor into the analysis, especially then when Israel had substantial operational control and certainly air control as well. So I think you have to take everything with a grain of salt about who's positioned where, why they've taken the actions that they've taken. We also need to be thinking about, is there a substantial enough population on the ground that you're not going to end up with a regime that's even worse than the malocracy the day after it falls? But obviously there are myriad benefits to what's already occurred in terms of shaking the regime. When you've had reports of, in some cases, police forces there putting down their arms, there could be an internal power struggle, which could be hugely beneficial. But at the end of the day, this is the world's leading state sponsor of jihad. The president said that effectively there's going to be hell to pay. He's continued to sort of threaten that rhetorically. There's always the desire to make a deal. And I'm sure there are some who would say, well, look, the regime is as weak as it's maybe ever been post 1979. So now they're going to be more desperate than ever to make a deal. But it's hard to fathom any sort of deal. There's been talked about a framework of no ballistic missiles on top of the nuclear enrichment and no support of jihadist proxies, et cetera. But this is what the regime is about. I mean, this is the regime.
Yeah.
This is what they survive on, is the ballistic missiles threat, the nuclear threat, it's jihadist proxies to project power, et cetera. So I don't believe ultimately there's any deal to be made with the world's leading state sponsor of jihad that has the blood of effectively hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans on its hands directly and by proxy. So if I'm a betting man, I think ultimately that there is going to be some sort of action from the U.S., but I can't tell you when that's going to be, and I can't tell you if it will prove decisive or not. But if I'm betting on the situation, even if there appears to be calm now, I don't think we've heard the last of potential strikes. And I think it's in no small part because that regime was destabilized by the 12-day war. And there is a massive opportunity to neutralize the key junior partner of China and Russia. And if you look at the broader map and the broader picture of things, Venezuela, in no small part, the removal of Maduro and now the attempt to sort of manage the country in America's national interest was, in my view, all about neutralizing Russian, Chinese, and Iranian influence in our hemisphere. That's one of the partners of China and Russia, not just for oil, but in terms of serving as effectively a forward operating base in our hemisphere. Iran is another domino to fall. They've already been cut off and alienated in large part. The regime is shaky. It wouldn't kill thousands of people if it wasn't shaky. So I think when there's a chance for victory, the president wants to win. I think striking of the nuclear infrastructure was in no small part because Israel had created unique conditions to strike a decisive blow that would have outsized positive benefits and make America a winner and advance our interests in a much bigger geopolitical battle. So that's why my assessment is certainly there are folks who counsel a deal and restraint, and there's a time and a place for restraint, and there are times where it's prudent to act in a restrained fashion. But if you can remove a cancerous regime with minimal collateral damage to the U.S. or direct damage to the U.S., and it can be replaced by something that is far more favorable, obviously that would be a massive boon. And I think that's why you see the reporting suggesting that the president is looking for plans that are decisive. And obviously we shouldn't discount, of course, the sort of strategic ambiguity. Some information saying one thing, some information saying another thing. This cohort, this faction is arguing this faction is arguing that. We've seen that time and time again, and it makes it very hard for our adversaries to get a read on us, and I think that's purposeful.
Yeah. Aside from the fact that some people in the White House always leak to liberal newspapers, which is inexplicable, but keeps happening. And I think as far as Iran, in the end, the Iranian people are going to have to overthrow the regime. The question is whether the United States and the West will help to prop up the regime as it did under Obama, or will help the people, of Iran, or at least signal their support for that. One final question, and this relates to sort of the future of conservatism in this country. And you're sort of part of the national conservative movement. You're on the NatCon, podcast. Probably the most important national conservative thinker in this country is Vice President J.D. Vance. And he has expressed neutrality about the question of, what is the place of people like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens, who have been platforming anti-Semitism or expressing anti-Semitism. Speaking of Carlson, somebody who was against the whole idea of the Judeo-Christian heritage. That has raised, an important question about, do conservatives have their own anti-Semitism problem? And while it might not be as pervasive as the one on the left, it's still obviously there. And where do you see this going? And how do you see this playing out as, we just spoke about the 2028 cycle for the Democrats. How do you see this playing out for the Republicans?
Well, let me say I'm going to deal with this issue at length in an essay that's going to be part of an anthology on the imperative for positive relations between Jews and Christians to advance our shared interests. So I will address a lot of what you just raised at length there. In short form here, what I'll say is this. Movements have to be discriminating about the voices that they promote and the ideas that are tolerated and not tolerated. So I don't know any conservatives who want to cancel or silence people who say ignorant things, who say repugnant things. But I do think it's imperative to say that there are certain ideas and values and principles that are totally antithetical to what our movement is supposed to be about. Is there an anti-Semitism problem on the right? Some of those who are the most odious, it's hard to say how they could be even on the right when you actually look at what the worldview is. And in fact, if anything, it seems like they're trying to disunite the right, side with our adversaries. And they've gone so far as to say that it's not just that we have a corrupted deep state or that our government has worked at cross purposes to the American people when under Democrat control, and that the Jews are somehow behind it among the most odious of these actors, but that America is actually uniquely evil and our adversaries are actually good. Setting aside in terms of just the politics and the sheer numbers of, okay, you're going to attack Christian Zionists which is basically, millions of evangelicals that are the base for the Republican Party. How is that winning politically? On the merits, it's contemptible. So I think at the end of the day, you do have some pundits who this is a business model for them. Some are true believers, some are cynics, some are useful idiots. They are profiting and they see a model here. To the extent there are ties to the Arab world, look, they may be making the same calculation that many policymakers have made over time, which is that the Arab countries are large and they're rich, and Israel is a tiny place, and the Jews are a really tiny population, and so they've made their bed. Who knows? Each individual actor, there's their own motives and their own worldview that is driving and guiding their actions. I do not think that the right is in the place that the left is. I don't think that the Republican Party is by any stretch lost. I think the vigorous backlash in some instances that you've seen reflects that there are still antibodies, which say that, first of all, obviously, Jew hating is repugnant. It's antithetical to our values and principles. It's antithetical to the fact that this country was founded on Judeo-Christian Western principles, and that our founding fathers themselves saw America as something like Israel and revered the Torah and revered the Jewish people and wanted to protect them, obviously dating back to George Washington and the Rhode Island Synagogue letter and a whole slew of other sources that you can look to there. So to the extent that there are pundits and maybe some intellectuals who are advocating otherwise, it's completely inconsistent with our worldview and our heritage. And then obviously, you have some people are saying, well, it's about Israel, it's not about Jews. So we hate the Jewish state and we want to side with its enemies and effectively see it destroyed. But we love Jews, even though we're happy to see millions of them get obliterated there. That just is not a defensible argument at the end of the day. And I think some have cynically tried to conflate Jews and Israel where they shouldn't. But in other cases, it's clear that the hatred of Israel and the antipathy, when you're not going to say, well, what is your favorite policy towards Israel and why does it advance America's national interest? And why do these alternatives you claim to support, how do they actually move the ball for us? I think it becomes very clear that they're intellectually dishonest arguments that are being put forth. So there's a lot of different threads one can pull on here, but I would just say ultimately that there clearly is a rise in Jew hatred among some who proclaim to be on the right. Clearly, the younger generation, which has shown itself to be, in some percentage of it, averse to any intervention. Look, aversion to foreign aid and globalist multilateral institutions is entirely understandable. And I've argued before myself when it comes to Israel that I think the U.S. and Israel would ultimately each be better off if Israel had an independent defense production capacity, and that if we dealt with each other as allies and partners, and that maybe the aid, so-called aid, foreign assistance, which is really more like a joint venture that benefits U.S. defense contractors and the Israelis alike, that this is, while for friends of Israel, it's truly viewed as part of a mutually beneficial relationship. For its foes, this is a lever of U.S. over Israel. And when you look back at the current memorandum of understanding negotiated by the Obama administration, I believe that was about, first of all, silencing Jewish critics among Democrats and also bribing Israel into a box, while at the same time the administration was defending and protecting Iran. So aid is also a lever. It's a form of power and control and can be a form of coercion to the extent you have a hostile administration. And I'll point out, we have this debate right now that's already unfolding about the next package. And we've seen these reports that President Trump himself doesn't really understand, although he's open to thinking about it, why Israel might not want to have another aid package. You'll note that the Israel haters and the Jew haters, or the Jew haters masquerading in some instances as Israel haters, they've not said anything. They haven't come out hailing Prime Minister Netanyahu for wanting to have independence and severing potentially the aid relationship. Nor, of course, do they talk about, well, what do we get from aid to Egypt or Lebanon or myriad other countries, and is that in America's national interest?
Never mind NATO.
Never mind NATO, right. So it's very notable, and I think it exposes the hollowness of the arguments, the intellectual dishonesty and disingenuousness of the arguments. And I'm curious to see if there's a fight over the next aid package that is part of primaries on the Republican and Democrat side going into 2028. We'll see if it ultimately gets resolved before then. But it's a long-winded answer to your question of saying there is somewhat of a parallel on the right to the left in the way of some percentage siding with adversaries, siding against Israel, and siding against the Jews, rooted in some instances, a deep-seated hatred of the Jews. It's different from why the left or the Islamists might hate them. There are other explanations. Some putatively theological, even though I think they're in a warped version of theology, and some on other grounds as well. I don't think it's as large. I don't think that it is as powerful, but it is a factor, and it probably matters in the political calculations of some. But what I would say at the end of the day is it doesn't really make sense from a political calculation perspective, setting aside whether it is right to countenance these people. And I think I've been pretty clear about where I stand on that, that it's wrong. At the end of the day, you're talking about potentially rejecting the views of millions of Americans who are your base, who are your core. So it's inexplicable, unless you want to lose elections, why you would swallow wholesale and tolerates the genuine Jew haters or Israel haters masquerading as Jew haters. It's not a smart political play. It's obviously wrong and repugnant on the merits. But that said, it's a cautionary tale, or it's disturbing that you have the younger generation coming up, being indoctrinated the way that they are, and that crosses both the left and the right. And that potentially does portend very bad things to the extent that you have a growing cohort on the right and a left and a Democrat Party that, in my view, is already gone. Because ultimately, the Jew hatred is really just the canary in the coal mine and the proxy for hatred of America, hatred of the West. And it portends disastrous things for everyone, Jewish, Christian, and otherwise alike. And that's something that we can't tolerate and we shouldn't tolerate, and would be a disaster for the free world ultimately, to the extent the Jew hatred continues to grow.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. Ben, thanks so much for joining us today. Can you tell our audience how they can follow your work and where they can see it?
Yep, please subscribe to my Substack at weingarten.substack.com. I write as a contributor for Real Clear Investigations, a senior contributor for The Federalist. I'm a contributor at Newsmax frequently as well, but all of my work, wherever it is, I end up sharing via my Substack, and then follow me on X at BHWeingarten.
Great. Well, they should do that. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition. And whether you're listening wherever you get your podcasts, and whether you're watching us on one of those platforms or watching us live on Facebook or X, please, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think of it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.